Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we examine the United States' declaration of a national emergency over the perceived threat posed by Cuba, a move that significantly raises pressure on Havana as the country faces an imminent fuel crisis with major implications for social stability and foreign business operations. Across Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we assess Russia's record-breaking missile strikes on Ukraine following a claimed energy truce, the first round of scheduled direct talks between the US and Iran in Oman amid elevated military posturing, a major Islamic State-linked attack on Niamey airport in Niger, a mass-casualty Boko Haram attack in Nigeria's Kwara state, and renewed clashes in Ethiopia's Tigray region that have disrupted flights and raised fears of a return to civil war. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover a series of coordinated militant attacks across Pakistan's Balochistan province, marking a significant escalation in the country's long-running insurgency. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where President Trump has declared a national emergency over the perceived threat posed by Cuba, sharply escalating pressure on the island as fuel shortages deepen. An executive order issued by President Donald Trump on January 29th declared a national emergency in response to what the administration called the threat of Cuba. The order cited the Cuban government's alleged ties to Russia, China, Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah, and stated that Cuba constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat. It also opened the door for new unspecified tariff rates to be imposed on countries that directly or indirectly sell or provide oil to Cuba. In response, Cuba's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, said on January 30th that the United States government itself constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat. He added that, with the survival of humanity now at risk from nuclear danger and climate change, Cuba was declaring an international emergency. As tensions rise and Cuba's energy crisis deepens, several embassies and international companies are reportedly reviewing their contingency and evacuation plans. Nearly a dozen European and Latin American countries have anonymously confirmed updating their evacuation procedures and lists of nationals currently in Cuba. At the same time, several subsidiaries of international companies have quietly acknowledged reconsidering their operations on the island, among them the British multinational Unilever, which has already evacuated the families of its foreign employees. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Cuba has faced a series of nationwide and localized power blackouts since 2022, triggering occasional outbreaks of civil unrest, a rare occurrence in the communist one-party state. The ongoing power crisis, driven by aging infrastructure, rising demand, and persistent fuel shortages, is now almost certain to worsen following the fall of President Maduro in Venezuela after U.S. military intervention. Venezuela had been supplying Cuba with around 70,000 barrels of oil per day. Although Cuba resold a significant share of that oil to Asian markets to obtain hard currency, the collapse of Venezuela's government has now cut off that supply entirely. The Mexican state oil company Pemex had been supplying Cuba with an additional 20,000 barrels of oil per day. However, Washington has placed significant pressure on Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum to halt those deliveries. Although Sheinbaum has maintained that humanitarian aid will continue, she has also acknowledged that Mexico's oil shipments to Cuba remain suspended. Global trade consultancy data shows that Cuba has received just 84,900 barrels of oil this year, all from a single Mexican shipment in January. As a result, estimates now suggest the country has only enough reserves to last between 15 and 20 days. Shipments from other suppliers, including Russia and Algeria, have been irregular. Meanwhile, President Trump's executive order and the threat of new tariffs are placing additional pressure on countries that export oil to Cuba. It is likely that Cuba stands on the brink of a severe fuel crisis. Figures within the Trump administration, notably Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the son of Cuban émigrés and a staunch opponent of the Cuban regime, are almost certainly advocating for regime change in Havana. President Trump has already claimed that Cuba is about to fall. However, on January 31st, he added that he believes Cuba will probably come to us and want to make a deal that would almost certainly require significant concessions to Washington. While Cuba has previously resold a large share of its imported oil to obtain foreign currency, that revenue remains vital to the country's economy, given the profound weakness of the Cuban peso. As an island nation heavily dependent on imports, Cuba needs hard currency to purchase most essential goods from abroad. The deepening crisis is therefore highly likely to affect the supply of basic necessities. The largest protests in Cuba in recent years took place in 2021, sparked by shortages of food and medicine. Meanwhile, the tourism industry, another key source of foreign currency, has already been in decline due to ongoing economic difficulties. It is now almost certain to suffer further as both diplomatic and domestic tensions intensify. Cuba has already been facing what some academics describe as a polycrisis, marked by record emigration, soaring inflation, currency depreciation, severe shortages of goods, and widening inequality. The likely onset of a major fuel crisis now poses an existential threat to the regime. Cuba depends on oil shipments not only for energy production, but also for generating hard currency, while the tourism sector is almost certain to weaken further. With all three of these pillars under severe strain, and each amplifying the others, the Cuban government is likely to face its most serious challenge to power in 2026 since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, where Russian forces have launched a record number of missiles against Ukraine following the expiry of a claimed energy truce. On January 29th, US President Donald Trump claimed that, after a personal appeal, Russian President Vladimir Putin had agreed to pause strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Trump said the truce would last for a week, citing the extreme cold that has driven temperatures in Ukraine down to minus 20 degrees Celsius and below. The Kremlin later confirmed, through spokesman Dmitry Peskov, that Putin had agreed to a personal request to refrain from launching strikes on Kiev until February 1st. During the truce period, Russian forces continued to carry out strikes against civilian targets, including a maternity hospital in Zaporizhzhia Oblast and a bus carrying mine employees in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which killed 16 people. Then, overnight between February 2nd and 3rd, following the end of the claimed truce, Russia launched a major wave of attacks, primarily targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The strikes focused on Kiev, but also hit sites in Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Vinnytsia, and Odessa oblasts. The assault involved a combined strike package of 450 attack drones and decoys, along with a record 71 missiles. Numerous combined heat and power plants, thermal power plants, and electrical substations were successfully struck. Complete heat outages were reported in Kyiv's Darnitsky and Dniprovsky districts, while authorities in Kharkiv declared a local state of emergency. These attacks occurred just days before the second round of trilateral talks was set to begin in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates on February 4th. Now, our intelligence assessment. The so-called energy truce shared many of the same shortcomings as the US-brokered energy infrastructure moratorium of March 2025. As was the case then, there was no agreed mechanism for monitoring or verification, no system of enforcement or penalties, vague and inconsistent terms, and an unclear time frame. In practice, the gap between Russia's large-scale, layered aerial assaults has remained broadly consistent. The previous major strike, overnight on January 23rd to 24th, during the first round of trilateral talks in Abu Dhabi, occurred only a short time earlier. Russian forces almost certainly stockpile missiles between major operations, favoring periodic large-scale attacks that combine drones and missiles to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses and improve strike success rates. Reflecting this pattern, the February 2nd to 3rd attacks featured a record number of missiles, the highest of the Russo-Ukrainian war so far. Ukrainian air defenses are almost certainly struggling to intercept ballistic missiles. Apart from the less numerous SAMP/T system, the Patriot air defense system remains Ukraine's only reliable means of consistently countering such threats. Russian strike packages have increasingly incorporated larger numbers of ballistic missiles, almost certainly to exploit this weakness. Earlier, on January 16th, President Volodymyr Zelensky acknowledged that Ukraine's air defense systems were facing a shortage of interceptor munitions, particularly the Patriot PAC-3 MSE missiles, until a major resupply shipment arrived later that same day. The effects of interceptor shortages on Ukraine's ability to counter ballistic missiles were clearly demonstrated during the January 12th to 13th attacks. In that strike, Russia launched 18 Iskander-M ballistic missiles and S-300 air defense missiles, of which only 2 were intercepted. By contrast, Ukrainian forces successfully intercepted 5 of 7 Iskander-K cruise missiles. Following the resupply shipment, interception rates improved markedly. During the January 19th to 20th attacks, Ukrainian air defenses reportedly downed 14 of 18 Iskander-M and S-300 missiles. However, during the February 2nd to 3rd assault, Ukrainian forces intercepted just 11 of 31 Iskander-M and S-300 missiles, an interception rate of roughly 34%. This lower figure does not necessarily suggest renewed shortages, but rather reflects the unusually high volume of ballistic missiles used, which likely overwhelmed Ukraine's air defenses. Russian forces, supported by the output of their military-industrial sector, are likely to continue increasing their use of ballistic missiles. This trend is driven both by the higher penetration rates that make such attacks more effective and by the limited availability of PAC-3 MSE interceptor missiles. By 2025, the United States was already struggling to keep pace with demand for new PAC-3 MSEs, amid heavy use in the Middle East and growing concerns about a global shortage. The need to maintain missile defenses for regional allies and U.S. bases, particularly against potential Iranian retaliation, has likely been a key strategic constraint for Washington. As a result, Ukraine will probably find it increasingly difficult to replenish its stock of interceptors, heightening the threat to cities far from the front lines if Russia continues its missile campaign. Staying in the region, the United States and Iran are set to hold direct talks in Oman, even as both sides maintain an elevated military posture that keeps escalation risks high. On February 6th, delegations from the US and Iran are scheduled to meet in Muscat, following lobbying by several Middle Eastern leaders urging Washington to avoid military action. However, undisclosed sources indicate that U.S. officials remain deeply skeptical of Iran's intentions. The negotiations were initially planned for Istanbul, with several regional leaders expected to attend as observers. Iran, however, requested that the talks be relocated to Oman and conducted in a strictly bilateral format, involving only U.S. and Iranian representatives. Tehran reportedly requested the exclusion of regional leaders to ensure that the discussions focus solely on nuclear matters, omitting issues that are priorities for other regional powers, particularly Iran's ballistic missile program and its support for proxy forces. On February 4th, reports suggested the talks were close to collapsing, with Washington insisting on the original Istanbul format. However, the White House is said to have agreed to the Oman venue after urgent lobbying from several Middle Eastern leaders. The talks in Muscat are expected to be attended by U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Witkoff will also travel to Qatar on February 5th as part of a broader diplomatic effort focused on regional de-escalation and the ongoing war in Gaza. The United States has continued to reinforce its military posture in the region, despite signs of diplomatic progress. Additional Patriot PAC-3 and Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense Systems have been deployed to protect U.S. forces, Israel, and Gulf partners. At the same time, U.S. Air Force logistical flights into the region have increased. This heightened state of readiness has already led to 2 recent incidents involving U.S. and Iranian forces. On February 3rd, U.S. Central Command reported that F-35s launched from the USS Abraham Lincoln had shot down an Iranian Shahed 139 UAV over the Arabian Sea, after it repeatedly and aggressively approached the carrier strike group. Just hours later, 2 vessels from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, accompanied by a Mohajer intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance drone, approached the U.S.-flagged and U.S. crude tanker MV Stena Imperative in the Strait of Hormuz and attempted to board it. The USS McFall, an Arleigh Burke-class Aegis-equipped destroyer operating nearby, responded and escorted the tanker, supported by defensive air cover from the U.S. Air Force. Now our team's assessment. Iran's request to shift the talks to a bilateral format in Oman is likely intended to shape the initial phase of negotiations around its nuclear program, rather than broader regional or security concerns. Tehran has long sought to establish 3 main forms of deterrence: a potential nuclear capability, conventional deterrence through its ballistic missile forces, and an asymmetric, and largely deniable, deterrence built around its network of regional proxy groups. Tehran's ballistic missile arsenal and network of proxy forces, though both degraded, remain its only credible means of deterrence. They are a major concern not only for Israel and the United States, but also for many Arab states. Iran has likely calculated that offering limited or reversible concessions on its nuclear program, which has yet to fully mature and has been set back by U.S. strikes, would be less strategically costly, while still sufficient to avert further escalation with Washington. For the Trump administration, meanwhile, nuclear-related concessions offer a potential diplomatic off-ramp. Under pressure from regional partners who have consistently pushed for diplomacy and ruled out the use of their territory for offensive operations against Iran, such an approach would allow de-escalation without eroding U.S. credibility or deterrence. However, it remains unlikely that the first phase of negotiations will yield any substantive concessions, and multiple rounds of talks are expected to follow. Iran has consistently maintained that its nuclear program is intended solely for civilian purposes. It will likely use the opening round to reinforce this narrative, probe U.S. red lines, and press for its own concessions on sanctions relief. Tehran has also emphasized that it will not enter into meaningful engagement while under coercion, a statement almost certainly directed at the continuing U.S. military buildup across the region. Even if an initial diplomatic breakthrough is achieved, the risk of escalation is likely to remain high. Iran has previously used negotiations to buy time, or has failed to fully comply with the terms of past agreements. Despite Tehran's insistence that it will not negotiate under duress, the United States is expected to maintain its elevated military posture, both to preserve leverage and deterrence, and to ensure compliance should any concessions be reached. The recent incidents in the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman underline the persistent danger of tactical miscalculation and unintended escalation. That risk is likely to endure, with both militaries almost certain to continue posturing and conducting high-tempo intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations. Iran has repeatedly issued statements and released propaganda warning that any escalation would trigger a regional war involving the Gulf states. This messaging is likely intended to establish deterrence by signaling that any conflict would be long, costly, and potentially damaging to the US's long-term presence in the Middle East. Senior commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have also stated that Israel would be the first target of any Iranian retaliation. While such a move would risk provoking an immediate Israeli response, it would likely serve to demonstrate Iranian capabilities, deliver deterrence, and limit the chances of direct escalation with the United States or the Gulf states. Elsewhere in the region, Islamic State-linked militants have carried out a coordinated drone and mortar attack on Niamey airport in Niger, prompting the United States to order the departure of non-essential embassy staff. On January 30th, the Islamic State-affiliated Amaq news agency claimed that its fighters had carried out a surprise and coordinated attack on Diori Hamani International Airport in Niamey during the early hours of January 29th. Footage shared on social media shows a group of at least 30 Islamic State Sahel province militants on motorcycles using drones and mortars to strike the airport and the adjacent air base 101. The video also shows the attackers breaching the airport perimeter and targeting civilian aircraft. 3 planes were damaged in the assault, one belonging to Air Côte d'Ivoire, which sustained damage to its fuselage and right wing, and 2 belonging to the Togolese airline ASKI. The attack lasted for around 30 minutes before Nigerian ground and air forces, supported by Russia's Africa Corps stationed at the base, responded and regained control of the site. According to the Nigerian government, Africa Corps forces pursued the attackers, killing at least 20 Islamic State Sahel province fighters and capturing 11 others, while 4 Nigerian soldiers were wounded. In the aftermath, Niger's ruling junta initially accused Benin, Ivory Coast, and France of involvement in the attack, though it provided no supporting evidence. On January 30th, the U.S. Department of State ordered the departure of non-emergency government employees and their family members from Niger. Now our assessment. The Islamic State Sahel province has been linked to several major attacks in Niger since late 2025, with an estimated 127 people killed in 5 separate incidents since March. The group has also expanded its activities to include the abduction of foreign nationals. However, this marks the first recorded instance of ISSP using one-way attack drones in Niger. Its regional rival, Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, has been employing drones since 2023 and has carried out more than 100 one-way drone attacks to date. A high-profile JNIM attack took place in September 2024 on a military training area next to Bamako's Modibo Keita International Airport. The recent assault on Niamey Airport, which involved no looting, was almost certainly symbolic. It was highly likely designed to inflict maximum damage on a prominent target, while demonstrating the group's military capability and strength to potential recruits, a key audience in its ongoing competition with JNIM. The attack was also highly likely intended to send a strategic message to Niger's military junta, demonstrating ISSP's ability to strike regime-critical infrastructure in the capital despite increased security measures. Niamey Airport lies just 10 kilometers from the presidential palace and almost certainly serves as a symbol of the junta's control. The assault therefore likely aimed to undermine the regime's authority and expose its inability to safeguard key infrastructure. Islamic State militants involved in the attack reportedly spoke Kanuri, a language widely used across the Lake Chad Basin, where Islamic State West Africa province is most active. ISWAP has been particularly prolific in its use of drone warfare, conducting at least 10 attacks since 2024. Primarily targeting Nigerian military super camps. Over the past 5 years, ISSP and ISWAP have strengthened their collaboration through the Maktab al-Furqan Regional Office, which coordinates Islamic State operations across West Africa. Through this network, ISWAP has provided ISSP with fuel, weapons, fighters, and training support. It is likely that ISWAP members assisted ISP in carrying out the Niamey operation, suggesting a possible long-term strategy aimed at enhancing ISP's capabilities through the transfer of technology, expertise, tactics, and other forms of support. There is a realistic possibility that this forms part of a broader ISWAP strategy to expand ISSP's threat profile, particularly as ISSP has moved into parts of northwest Nigeria. In the longer term, such a development could compel Nigeria's already overstretched military to divert resources towards the northwest, giving ISWAP greater freedom of movement in the northeast and across the wider Lake Chad basin. However, this dynamic is also likely to strengthen the case for increased external assistance in Nigeria's counter-terrorism operations, especially as the United States continues to expand its military activities in the region under the Trump administration. In West Africa, suspected Boko Haram militants have killed more than 170 people in villages in Nigeria's Kwara state, signaling a likely resurgence in high-casualty attacks during the dry season. Late on February 3rd, hundreds of gunmen stormed the villages of Woro and Nuku, killing at least 170 people. Witnesses reported that the attackers entered around 5:30 p.m. local time, rounded up residents, bound their hands, and executed them. The militants then set fire to shops and the king's palace as survivors fled into nearby bushland. The assaults continued for several hours, extending into February 4th, and the whereabouts of the local king remain unknown. The gunmen had reportedly visited Woro on previous occasions, urging residents to renounce their allegiance to the Nigerian state and adopt Sharia law. The latest attack is believed to have been carried out after villagers refused to comply with those demands. Search efforts for additional victims are still underway, and the death toll is highly likely to rise. Officials have attributed the assault to jihadist groups and have deployed an army battalion to Kwara's Kayama constituency. President Bola Tinubu has specifically blamed the jihadist organization, Boko Haram, for the attack. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. While no group has yet claimed responsibility, the attacks were almost certainly carried out by Boko Haram's Shiroro cell, based in Niger State, which borders Kwara to the northwest of Abuja. This cell represents the group's furthest expansion beyond the Lake Chad Basin and Borno State, its traditional strongholds. The Shiroro cell has embedded itself within local Fulani communities, providing access to a steady flow of recruits, weapons, and local intelligence. It is led by Abubakar Saidu, also known as Sadiku, who was dispatched to Niger State in 2014 by former Boko Haram leader Abubakar Shekau. Under his command, the cell has routinely launched attacks against both security forces and civilians in the region. The villagers were predominantly Muslim and were highly likely targeted because they refused to adopt Boko Haram's strict interpretation of Sharia law. Within the group's ideology, Muslim leaders or communities that reject its methods are labeled infidels and become priority targets. As a result, Boko Haram frequently attacks mosques and Muslim villages. Other common targets include Christians, individuals seen as government supporters, journalists, teachers, health workers, and internally displaced persons. This latest attack follows an earlier incident on January 30th, when suspected Boko Haram militants targeted construction workers in the town of Sabon Gari in northeastern Borno State. Together, these incidents almost certainly indicate that Boko Haram activity in Borno, Niger, and Kwara states will increase in the months ahead. Late 2025 saw relatively few attacks by the group, limited mostly to isolated ambushes and clashes with security forces in October and November. The last major assault on a village occurred in September 2025, when Boko Haram attacked Dar el Jamal in Borno State. Historically, the group's most lethal attacks have taken place during the dry season, which runs from November to May. A similar pattern is highly likely in 2026, with militant activity expected to rise sharply through the dry months, while Boko Haram reverts to smaller, opportunistic ambushes and raids during the wet season. The attacks also followed a Nigerian military announcement that it had killed a senior Boko Haram commander, Abu Khalid, the group's second-in-command in the Sambisa forest, along with 10 other militants during a night operation in Borno State. In early 2026, Nigerian security forces, almost certainly supported by U.S. intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, began pushing deeper into insurgent-controlled areas of Borno. The brutal, high-profile assaults in Kwara State were likely intended, at least in part, to divert security forces from the Lake Chad basin and stretch their operational capacity. As a result, intensified security operations in both Niger and Kwara states are highly likely over the coming months. And in the Horn of Africa, renewed clashes in Ethiopia's Tigray region have led to flight cancellations and renewed concerns over a return to full-scale civil war. On January 29th, fighting broke out once again between the Ethiopian National Defense Force, supported by Amhara militants, and the Tigray Defense Forces. The clashes occurred in Maidugusha, a disputed area within the Tselemti district of western Tigray. The following day, TDF forces captured Alamata and Korem in southern Tigray after Ethiopian troops withdrew from the area. Tensions rose further on January 31st, when a Tigrayan official accused the Ethiopian National Defense Force of carrying out drone strikes on 2 Isuzu trucks near Nticho and Genbet in Tigray, killing one person and injuring another. Tigrayan People's Liberation Front affiliated media claimed the vehicles were transporting food and cooking supplies, while pro-government activists asserted they were carrying weapons. On February 1st, the Tigray Defense Forces withdrew from the Tselemti district. Tadesse Werede Tesfaye, the TDF's commander-in-chief, said the move was intended to demonstrate the group's willingness to pursue dialogue and a peaceful resolution under the mediation of the African Union. In response to the renewed fighting, Ethiopian Airlines initially suspended all flights between Addis Ababa and Tigray. Fearing a return to full-scale war, many Tigrayan residents rushed to withdraw cash from banks, institutions that had previously shut down during the 2020 to 2022 conflict. The British Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office issued a travel advisory warning against all travel to all parts of Tigray region. That alert remains in effect as of February 5th. Ethiopian Airlines resumed flights on February 3rd, following the Tigray Defense Forces' withdrawal from the Tselemti district and their stated readiness to engage in talks. Amid rising tensions in Tigray, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has accused Eritrea's army of carrying out a massacre in Aksum over a 2-day period in November 2020. He alleged that Eritrean forces demolished homes, looted property, destroyed industrial sites, and seized machinery during their capture of Tigrayan cities. Eritrea, whose forces fought alongside Ethiopia during the Tigray War, has previously denied all such allegations. Now, our intelligence assessment. Tensions in Tigray have been building since March 2025, when a faction of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, led by Debretsion Gebremichael, staged a coup against the government-appointed interim regional administration headed by Getachew Reda. Following the coup, Ethiopia's electoral authorities deregistered the TPLF, accusing it of failing to hold a general assembly, a move the group said violated the Pretoria Agreement that had brought the earlier conflict to an end. By late 2025, the TPLF was accusing the Ethiopian government of backing several anti-TPLF factions. Alleged TPLF attacks on civilians in the Afar region prompted a drone strike on Raya Azebo in November, which killed both Tigrayan fighters and civilians. The latest clashes now almost certainly threaten to push Tigray back into full-scale civil war, despite Commander Tesfay's call for renewed dialogue. The renewed fighting also risks further heightening tensions with Eritrea. Relations between Addis Ababa and Asmara have steadily deteriorated since the end of the Tigray War. Ethiopian authorities have accused Eritrea, which was not a signatory to the Pretoria Agreement, of shifting allegiances and collaborating with the TPLF faction led by Debretsion Gebremichael against Ethiopian forces. At the same time, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has adopted an increasingly assertive stance on access to the Red Sea, describing Eritrea's secession as a mistake that will be corrected. Over the past year, this rhetoric has coincided with rising hostility and repeated troop buildups along the border, the last of which occurred in March 2025. Abiy's recent remarks regarding Eritrea's alleged atrocities are almost certainly intended to be provocative, and they are highly likely to further inflame interstate tensions, raising the risk of additional troop deployments and potential clashes along the border. Now shifting to Asia-Pacific, coordinated militant attacks across Pakistan's Balochistan province have triggered large-scale counterinsurgency operations and raised the likelihood of reprisal attacks beyond the region. Between January 30th and 31st, the Balochistan Liberation Army carried out a wave of coordinated small arms and bomb attacks across the province, lasting roughly 40 hours. The assaults formed part of the group's Operation Herof Phase 2 and were immediately claimed by the BLA. Attacks were reported in at least 9 districts, including Quetta, Mastung, and the port city of Gwadar. BLA militants targeted military and police facilities, a high-security prison, and blocked key roads in urban areas. Pakistan's Defense Minister, Khawaja Asif, said the BLA is increasingly targeting civilians, laborers, and low-income communities. He also noted reports that militants disguised as civilians had entered hospitals, schools, banks, and markets before opening fire. Pakistani security forces launched large-scale counter-terrorism operations in response, involving the Pakistan Army, Frontier Corps, and police units. These operations remain ongoing and have led to numerous localized clashes across the province. According to Pakistani government sources, the coordinated attacks and ensuing security operations have left more than 170 BLA militants dead, along with 31 civilians and 17 members of the security forces. The BLA, however, has claimed that nearly 200 Pakistani security personnel were killed during the assaults. In the wake of the violence, authorities have imposed a 1-month ban on public gatherings, the display of weapons, and motorcycle pillion riding, while also restricting vehicle movement across Balochistan. Now, our intelligence assessment. The BLA's recent offensive represents the largest and most coordinated series of attacks in the group's modern history, following its hijacking of the Jaffa Express train in March 2025. These incidents suggest that the organization has grown increasingly emboldened and is seeking to exploit Pakistan's current instability and overstretched security apparatus. Pakistan's security forces are already under strain, contending simultaneously with Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan militancy, ethnic and sectarian tensions, widespread political unrest, and heightened friction with India. The coordinated and geographically dispersed nature of the BLA's attacks was almost certainly intended to stretch the government's resources further, hindering its ability to concentrate forces and mount an effective response. Pakistan will highly likely reallocate additional security resources to Balochistan in response to the recent attacks and significantly expand counterinsurgency operations across the province, a move that is expected to result in further casualties. Expanded cordon and search operations, new security checkpoints, intelligence-led raids, curfews, and other restrictions are likely to be introduced. While these measures may disrupt militant networks in the short term, they will almost certainly fuel local grievances and provoke further BLA reprisals. There is also a realistic possibility of retaliatory attacks outside the group's core area of operations, as the BLA has previously staged assaults in Karachi and other areas near Balochistan. Both the BLA attacks and the government's security response are likely to further undermine Chinese investment in Pakistan. Balochistan forms a key part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a project the BLA has long condemned as exploitative of the local population. According to government sources, the recent attacks differed from previous BLA operations through the increased use of female fidayeen, or suicide attackers. This marks a significant shift for the group, which has traditionally relied exclusively on male fighters and previously criticized suicide bombings. Ideologically, the BLA has framed the participation of women as evidence that state repression has driven even Baloch women to take up arms. The group also uses this narrative to shame men into joining the insurgency. From a tactical perspective, female attackers are employed to exploit security vulnerabilities, reducing suspicion, achieving surprise, and avoiding body searches in an extremely conservative society. However, any resulting increase in the searching, detention, or harassment of women by Pakistani security forces is likely to reinforce the narrative of Baloch repression and further inflame the insurgency. Several of the militants involved were reportedly from Afghanistan, which is home to an estimated 1 million ethnic Balochs. Their presence suggests the existence of cross-border facilitation networks and will likely prompt Islamabad to pressure the Taliban to take action against Baloch militant activity within Afghan territory. Pakistan has long accused the Taliban of harboring, supporting, and enabling the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan insurgency from across the border. This has previously led to Pakistani airstrikes in border areas, cross-border skirmishes, and even deep strikes into Kabul and other Afghan cities. While Pakistan's current counter-terrorism operations are likely to remain focused within its own borders, there is a realistic possibility of renewed cross-border strikes targeting militant safe havens and logistical networks in Afghanistan. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.